How could a massive aircraft filled with 239 people simply disappear from the radar screen without leaving a single trace? Believe it or not, but this is what exactly happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Flight 370 was a scheduled passenger flight from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, to Beijing, China on March 8, 2014. It had 227 passengers and 12 crew members on board and was flying on a Boeing 777, a large and reliable aircraft. The flight took off normally at 12:41 a.m. local time and reached a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet at 1:01 a.m. The last communication from the cockpit was at 1:19 a.m. when the co-pilot said, "Good night, Malaysian 370," to the air traffic control. However, at 1:21 a.m., something strange happened. The plane's transponder, which sends signals to the air traffic control, was switched off and the plane disappeared from the civilian radar. The plane also stopped sending data through the ACARS system, which monitors the performance of the aircraft. The only way to track the plane after that was through military, radar, and satellite communication. The disappearance of Flight 370 remains a mystery in the history, and nobody knows what exactly happened to the plane. There are countless theories which try to explain the mysterious disappearance of everything from a remote control hijacking to a mechanical or electrical failure, or somebody on board was responsible for the disaster. Let's try to find out what exactly happened to the Malaysian airline Flight 370. It was a clear night at Kuala Lumpur International Airport, where a Boeing 777 was preparing for its 6 hours journey to Beijing, China. The aircraft was being fueled and loaded with food cargo and 227 passengers.
Delivery Malaysian 370, good morning. Malaysian 370, good morning. 370, we are ready, requesting flight level 350 to Beijing.
Malaysian 370, request level.
Malaysian 370, thank you.
That's First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid requesting clearance to Beijing from air traffic control. This was a special flight for the 27-year-old officer. Flight 370 was his last training flight before being signed off to fly the Boeing 777. He had joined Malaysia Airlines as a cadet pilot 7 years previously in 2007 and had flown Boeing 777s and Airbus A330s for the airline. He had established an excellent performance record for himself. That's why the airline considered it safe for him to be paired with just one captain for the rest of the flight rather than the two, and sitting to his left was the captain, 53-year-old Zahari Ahmed Shah. Zahari had joined Malaysia Airlines as a cadet pilot in 1981. In this time, he had built up over 18,000 flying hours. This was an immense amount of experience, and it made him one of the most experienced pilots in the country. The captain took on an unnecessarily large, or even a suspicious amount of fuel, about 30 minutes more than the required fuel for the distance, but the truth is that Malaysia Airlines mandated all Beijing-bound flights to take on 30 minutes of additional holding fuel, so there is nothing suspicious here. Zahari nudged the 777 throttles forwards and began taxiing out to runway 32 right at Kuala Lumpur. The flight took off normally at 12:41 a.m. local time and reached a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet at 1:01 a.m. Zahari made a routine report to air traffic control.
Malaysian 370, Lumpur radar, good morning, climb flight level 250.
Morning, level 250, Malaysian 370.
But exactly about 6 minutes later, he made this report again.
Malaysian 370, climb flight level 350.
Level 350, Malaysian 370.
It was not necessary for him to make this report a second time. The passengers' Flight 370 had been about as routine as a flight can get. The flight attendants were making their way through the cabin with a meal service for those who were still awake. However, most of the passengers were asleep by this point. Step 1. The vanishing. Just seconds after saying good night to Kuala Lumpur Control Tower, Captain Zahari asked the first officer to go back into the cabin and get them both a cup of coffee. They had 5 hours of night flying ahead of them. The first officer dutifully headed back to the galley and closed the cockpit door. Behind him, normally the cabin crew would bring the coffee, but Farik was not about to question the man who held his career in his hands, now sitting alone in the warm cockpit. This is actually Captain Zahari had a master plan in his mind. He was trying to pull off the impossible, and he would now try to make the Flight 370 disappear from the radar screen. To do this, he will needed to turn off the plane's transponder, but he wasn't going to do this straight away. If he did it before he reached Agari, Malaysian air traffic control might notice him dropping off from their radar screens. He had to be waited until reached the next waypoint, and to be truly out of their jurisdiction. Zahari fixed his eyes on Agari as the active waypoint at the top right of the screen changed from Agari to the next waypoint. Exactly that moment, Zahari switched off the transponder, and Flight 370 disappeared from air traffic control screens in Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia. But Zahari didn't know that he had left a clue. The Boeing 777 has basically 3 settings: fully off, where no information is transmitted to air traffic control; altitude off, where only the plane's position but not its altitude is transmitted to air traffic control; and fully on, where its position, altitude, and a few other parameters are transmitted. For a split second, as Zahari twisted the dial towards the fully off position, it passed through the alt-off. For that second, as the dial passed through alt-off, stations on the ground received the plane's position while its altitude read 0. This is not what would happen if the plane had experienced a massive electrical failure leading to the loss of the transponder, among other systems. If that had happened, all of the data would have been lost at once. This brief partial loss of transponder data suggests that somebody in the cockpit was turning this dial manually to the off position, but this clue wouldn't be discovered for a long time. As far as Zahari was concerned, step 1 of his plan had been completed successfully. Step 2. Disabling ACARS. From that moment, nobody on the ground knew where Flight 370 was, and the plane continued turning towards the next waypoint on its route. Except there was still a problem. By disabling the transponder, Zahari had made the plane invisible to air traffic controllers, but Malaysia Airlines still knew that the plane was in the air. That's because the Boeing 777 is equipped with ACARS, Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System. This sends status reports from the plane to the airline via a satellite communication system called SATCOM. These status reports include information about the plane's fuel on board, its maintenance status, and even its position along its flight route every 30 minutes. Zahari knew that he couldn't truly disappear as long as ACARS was still functioning, so he needed to disable it. But disabling ACARS was not going to be as easy as turning off the transponder. If he turned ACARS off the normal way, it would send a message to the ground saying that it was being powered down. But this is not a great prospect if your mission is to disappear without a trace. To truly vanish without leaving a trace, the captain would need to do something far more drastic. He would need to essentially pull the plug right out of the socket so that ACARS would go dark immediately without sending the log-off message. To do this, Zahari reached up to the overhead panel and using 2 fingers turned off both engines' electrical generators. This instantly cut off the electrical supply to a whole host of aircraft systems, including the satellite communication system, which ACARS uses to send and receive its messages. Now, there was no way for anyone on the ground to receive information from the plane. As far as the outside world was concerned, it was over the South China Sea, where MAHA 370 had vanished. Disabling the SATCOM also had another benefit, which would be absolutely essential for the next step of the captain's plan. It meant that the satellite phone in the passenger cabin and the text message facility in the passengers' in-flight entertainment systems would no longer work. All lines of communication between Flight 370 and the outside world had been dispatched. Zahari then turned off the plane's external lights. Now Flight 370 was fully invisible from the people on the ground, but behind him were 238 passengers' problems expecting to be flown to Beijing. The first officer was making coffee, and he would be returning to the cockpit very shortly. To carry out his full plan, Zahari would somehow need to incapacitate every single person on the aircraft. And to that end, he had an unconventional weapon air, or more specifically thin air. At 35,000 feet, there is only enough air to keep a human meaningfully conscious for about 45 seconds. But the air inside a passenger aircraft is pressurized, it's compacted like the gas in a soft drink. If the captain could somehow open a hole in his plane, most of this air would come rushing out. Luckily for him, he could open a hole on the underside of the plane. There were two valves aptly named outflow valves. By opening them, he could vent all of this condensed air out into the atmosphere. The captain pulled out his oxygen mask, placed it over his head, and now he had his own oxygen supply. From the overhead panel, he prevented the engines from bringing new air into the cabin. Then he pressed a switch which turned the aircraft's cabin pressurization from automatic to manual. Now he controlled the amount of air inside the aircraft's cabin, the lifeblood of all 238 people behind him. As the air came rushing out, any passengers who had been sleeping were startled awake by the noise and the change in air pressure. Their ears popped and the oxygen masks dropped automatically from the ceiling. The sudden expansion of the air inside the cabin made it significantly colder. Zahari was right beside Thai airspace, and the last thing he wanted was to burst into an airspace which he hadn't been cleared to enter, because even though he had disabled the transponder, there was still one way that he could be detected by primary radar. Primary radar is the most basic kind of radar, and it works on the very simple principle of reflectant. A radar dish on the ground sends out a signal which bounces off any objects in the air, including planes and flocks of birds, and is reflected back to the radar dish. Because it just works by bouncing radio waves off an aircraft's skin, there is no way for a pilot to avoid being detected by primary radar. But at the same time, because it's such a simple system, all it can tell is where an object is. It can't tell what it is. How high is it? If Thailand's military spotted an unidentified target infringing upon their airspace, they could well scramble fighter jets to investigate who the mystery intruder was. So as just over 2 minutes after beginning his turn, he checked his position on his navigation display. To his relief, he had to avoid Thai airspace. Flight 370 was now headed in opposite direction back towards Malaysia. He would now have to cross back over the Malaysian peninsula without being intercepted by the Malaysian or Thai Air Force, and he would have to do this without having his plans spoiled by the 238 people behind him in the main cabin. The passengers were confused. They had put on their oxygen masks and were listening intently to the cabin crew's instructions. The first officer was ready to return to the cockpit to help the captain with the current emergency, but on the other side of the cockpit door, the captain had other plans. The passenger oxygen masks only provide about 20 minutes of oxygen. The reason for that is that this gives enough time for the pilots to descend to a safe altitude where the air is breathable. This usually takes about 10 minutes. None of the passengers of crew knew it yet, but they would not be descending to a breathable altitude. Their time was running out. First Officer Farrick approached the cabin. There were 15 of the oxygen bottles distributed throughout the cabin, one for each of the flight attendants on a maximum crew flight. There were just 10 cabin crew on board, so there was more than enough for each of them, and unlike the passenger oxygen masks, these bottles had 44 minutes of oxygen, more than the crew could possibly need in any conceivable emergency. But this emergency had never been conceived of. Farrick was the only person on board breathing from a portable oxygen bottle. The flight attendants had followed their training and had quickly sat down at one of the spare passenger seats or at a flight attendant station and grabbed the 20-minute drop-down mask there. But Farrick's situation was different. He was badly needed in the cockpit, and a portable oxygen bottle was not enough for him. The only way to stay conscious, while he tried to gain entry, he picked up the handset, dialed the code to call the cockpit door, and put the receiver to his ear. In the cockpit, a message appeared on the captain's central display cabin call. If Zahari wanted to open the door, all he had to do was rotate the switch on the center pedestal from the auto position to the unlock position. The door will unlock. The light on the entry keypad outside the door would turn green and Farrick would be able to push it open. Farrick waited and watched as the light on the entry keypad continued glowing red. It should only have taken a second for the captain to unlock the door. Why was he not doing this? The first officer figured out himself that he must have been very busy handling whatever emergency this was. He waited for a few moments, and then again the cabin call message appeared on the captain's display, and again he ignored it. This was terrifying. The aircraft had depressurized, and it wasn't descending. Something was going seriously wrong up front in the cockpit. On the other side of the door, Zahari's plan was to skirt the border between Thai airspace and Malaysian airspace this way. When the Malaysian military saw the plane on radar, they would assume that it was being handled by Thai controllers, and likewise, when the Thai military saw the plane, they would assume that it was being handled by Malaysian controllers. And even if they did realize that it was Malaysia Flight 370, they may think that it was making an emergency return to an airport. The flight would be the concern of the civilian controllers, who were surely dealing with the plane. But in reality, Malaysian civilian controllers had handed the plane off to Hoi Minh in Vietnam. They weren't even thinking about it anymore. Flight 370 was in limbo. One last option for the cockpit door keypads: don't just accept one code. As well as the normal code, there is a special code for the rare event in which the pilots are helpless and the cabin crew need to gain access with this code. The door opens automatically if the pilots haven't responded after 30 seconds. But of course, this emergency code could easily be used by hijackers to gain entry to the cockpit. So to prevent this in the cockpit, pilots have the option of turning the door switch to the deny position within 30 seconds of the code being entered. This clever logic allows screws to gain entry to the cockpit in case of a pilot incapacitation, but also allows flight crew to deny entry to hijackers. The first officer hurried over to the keypad and punched in the emergency code. A loud buzzer sounded in the cockpit. If the captain was helpless, the door would automatically open in just 30 seconds. Farrick waited 10 seconds, past then 20, but those final seconds came and went, and the keypad light remained red. The first officer entered the code once again, this time more carefully, and he waited, counting down the seconds using his watch. And yet again, after 30 seconds, the light remained red. This could only mean one thing on the other side of the cockpit door. The captain had heard the buzzer and had turned the switch to deny. The passengers' oxygen masks would begin to run out, and all 227 of them would become hypoxic. The effects of hypoxia are much like the effects of alcohol. Zahari made a minor adjustment to stay on course as he carefully scanned the skies around him. He was now back over Peninsular Malaysia. He had been flying in these skies for day and night, and he knew the land so well that he could easily identify the various towns en route as he flew overhead. He knew that at his current speed, he would be able to cross the peninsula in about 20 minutes as he had his radio tuned to the Kuala Lumpur air traffic control frequency, so he could hear the controller talking to the other planes as normal in Malaysia at Hoi Min. However, controllers had noticed something odd. The Malaysian Ho Chi Minh notices that Flight 370 from Kuala Lumpur hadn't made contact. Sometimes it takes a few minutes before pilots get in touch, but what was unusual was that the flight wasn't even showing up on radar. The controller tried contacting the flight over the radio, but Hoi Min was far from Zahari mind at this point. Zahari was counting down the minutes until the passengers and crew would lose consciousness. As for his own oxygen supply, he was at no risk of running out. His supply came from 2 large tanks underneath the cockpit, which had enough oxygen to last 2 pilots 13 hours or 1 pilot 27 hours. Air traffic control was growing concerned. Flight 370 had still not turned up on radar, and it hadn't answered any of their calls. The controller had tried asking other planes in the area to make radio contact with the plane, including on the international frequency. The controller at Hoi Min telephoned to the Kuala Lumpur controller and told him that he hadn't been able to make radar contact with Flight 370. He asked whether the flight had turned back to Kuala Lumpur, but the Malaysian controller told him that something terrible had happened at the flight. The controller at Kuala Lumpur began calling out to Flight 370 on the radio in case it had returned to his airspace. Zahari was listening out but remained silent. For the first time that night, he had confirmation that the ground knew his plane was missing. The time was 1:41 in the morning, 20 minutes after the flight had disappeared from radar controllers. The air traffic controller was not at its best tonight, and as Zahari hoped that the Malaysian military was just as sleepy, because right at that moment his plane was a blip on their primary radar screens racing southwest across the peninsula. Zahari could see the passenger oxygen masks began to run out gradually. All 227 passengers would be unconscious, and they would suffer irreversible brain damage from oxygen deprivation, and then death. First Officer Farik was desperate. None of his attempts to get back into the cockpit had worked. Zahari had reached the next important step in his plan. Ahead of him, there were primary radar installations up and down the island, and there was no guarantee that the Indonesians would be as blase about an unidentified aircraft as the Malaysians had been. If he wanted to escape, he had to avoid Indonesian airspace altogether. So, for the next part of his plan, he would need to turn to the right and fly up straight to Mala. This way he would remain inside Malaysian airspace all the way until he went out of the range of primary radar. Malaysia Airlines had just found out that something was amiss with flight and sent an ACARS text message to the cockpit printer, asking the pilots to contact Hoi Min immediately. But this message didn't make it to the cockpit of Flight 370. The captain had stopped the ACARS from being able to communicate with the outside world. Meanwhile, air traffic controllers in Malaysia and Vietnam were becoming increasingly confused. Malaysia Airlines operations had told to Kuala Lumpur radar control that Flight 370 was in Cambodian airspace, but as Vietnamese controllers confirmed, Flight 370 was never supposed to enter Cambodian airspace. It was supposed to fly over Vietnam, and besides, Cambodian controllers couldn't see Flight 370 on the radar. So where was the flight? Was it over Cambodia or Vietnam, or was it in the air at all? Flight 370 slipped off the radar at Lan. Now truly the flight had gone dark. Over 200 people on board were dead. Zahari's final trick was to turn to the south and take his 777 deep into the southern Indian Ocean. Nobody could possibly know that he had taken this turn, and even if they somehow did, they wouldn't be able to find him. The Indian Ocean is enormous, and he could go deep into the middle of it. As far as this plan was foolproof, Zahari was dead at the end as expected, And this video is dedicated to those families and their loved ones on board the Flight 370.